Thomas Jefferson was controversial, but was he the flaming skeptic many make him out to be today? In 1776, Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress, was tasked to write the Declaration of Independence, one of the key documents in world history. He's often made out to be a virtual atheist or a leading skeptic, but is that accurate? He did entertain some private doubts late in life, and yet all his life he was a churchman when it was available. Here's a portion of our Providence Forum documentary, Endowed by their Creator, and this segment focuses on Jefferson the man, including his faith.
To appreciate the Declaration of Independence, it's helpful to examine the man behind its first major draft, Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson breathed his last on July 4, 1826, he died on the very same day John Adams, his one-time rival and later friend, had died. Adams died declaring, "Jefferson lives," but Jefferson had died earlier that day. The day of their departure from Earth was exactly 50 years after July 4, 1776. Thomas Jefferson has often been viewed as virtually a lifelong skeptic, more so than virtually all the Founding Fathers. In the presidential campaign of 1800, when he faced off against John Adams, Jefferson was vilified as if he were a non-Christian.
It was an accusation connected in some people's minds with Jefferson's friendship with a number of the leaders later in the French Revolution who were clearly infidels or atheists. You may recall that there was a de-Christianizing movement that grew up in the French Revolution where mobs would go into churches and tear down crosses and things like that. Now this happens after Jefferson leaves France, but he had been friends with some of the leading intellectuals that had been a part of the French Revolution. There are eyewitness reports that when news of Jefferson's election began to sweep across the country, especially in New England, that housewives were seen burying the family Bible in their gardens or hiding them in wells. Why? Because they thought of Jefferson and that connection with the de-Christianizing movement of the French Revolution.
Scholars ask, was Jefferson a lifelong skeptic? Author Mark Belials notes Jefferson basically went through different phases of his life, starting as a believing, practicing Anglican and ending as a practicing Anglican who harbored some serious private doubts. When he died, an Anglican minister buried him in the Anglican tradition at Jefferson's instructions.
Thomas Jefferson wrote what he wanted on his gravestone. That he founded the University of Virginia. He's the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and the author of the Declaration of Independence. He left off that he was the third president. He viewed these other things as more important. And when you look at those, he insisted that the Creator be acknowledged in the Declaration, and that here that we get our rights from a Creator and we have the freedom of conscience to worship this Creator.
Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 in Albemarle County, Virginia. He grew up as a loyal son of Virginia, as a member of the Church of England. He attended William and Mary, where he was exposed for the first time to some skeptical philosophical writings. Jefferson was happily married to Martha Skelton, and they had 6 children, but only 2 of them lived, 2 girls. His wife, Martha, died in 1782 when Jefferson was young, and she asked him to commit to never remarrying. Her death devastated the young Jefferson. He was a church-going man, even later in life when he privately entertained some serious doubts about core Christian doctrines. Whenever church was available to him, he attended virtually every week. He even helped found an independent evangelical church in 1777, a year after he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was the Calvinistical Reformed Church of Charlottesville. As a layman, Jefferson wrote up the bylaws for this church for this stated purpose, which included explaining the Holy Scriptures.
We, the subscribers, desirous of the benefits of gospel knowledge and religious improvement. Thomas Jefferson.
This was a voluntary church instead of the Anglican model where the state would tax the colonists and then the state would pay the pastors. Jefferson wrote the bylaws for this church. He supported the church financially more than any other of the laymen that were involved in the church. And they called an Anglican ordained minister named the Reverend Charles Clay, who was an evangelical. And he was also very patriotic. And Jefferson and Reverend Charles Clay corresponded for years.
In the same year of 1777, Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It was passed in 1786. It was a key forerunner to our First Amendment.
Almighty God has created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercion on either, as was in his almighty power to do, but to extend it by its influence on reason alone. Thomas Jefferson.
In other words, since Jesus gives humans freedom to accept or reject him, it is wrong for the state to compel belief. All religious force does is to beget habits of hypocrisy, according to Jefferson. When he was president, the new city of Washington hardly had any buildings, including churches. Jefferson approved of and attended weekly Christian services being held in the U.S. Capitol building. Jefferson not only attended church regularly, he was very generous to Christian causes all his life. He was particularly attached to the Episcopal Church. Near the end of his life, he made this clear.
I have been from my infancy a member of the Episcopalian Church, and to that I owe and make my contributions. Thomas Jefferson.
He also read the Bible, but he questioned if it was all truly divinely inspired. Despite his skepticism, Jefferson was a firm believer in the teachings of Jesus.
Of all the systems of morality, ancient or modern, which have come under my observation, none appear to me so pure as that of Jesus. Thomas Jefferson.
As president, when he negotiated the greatest single land acquisition in American history, the Louisiana Purchase, he realized that many Indian troops were now being added into America. Most of them were without the benefit of the teachings of Jesus. So one night in 1803 or 1804, as president, he took a copy of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he excised out of them many of the teachings of Jesus. He then pasted these on sheets of paper. He said the goal was to teach Native Americans what the teacher from Galilee had said 18 centuries before. There is no record this book was ever published. Today, people call this the so-called Jefferson Bible. It is a compendium of many of the teachings of Jesus Christ and does include a few miracles. He later revised the idea, but just for his own use, with the teachings of Jesus in English, Greek, Latin, and French. He purchased many Bible aids to assist him in his study of the Scriptures. He also read from various skeptics and Unitarians. When his daughter Polly died in 1804, his other daughter, Martha, came upon him.
I found him with the Bible in his hands, seeking consolation from the sacred volume. Martha Jefferson, daughter.
After he served as president, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, which was explicitly not tied to any one denomination, unlike Harvard or William and Mary.
It was non-sectarian. That's different from being secular. He did not want to outlaw God. Jefferson himself acknowledged God in the Declaration of Independence. The 5 quotes in the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. mentioned God. He just didn't think the government should be in the role of forcing people to acknowledge a faith that they didn't believe in.
Jefferson grew up as a slave owner. Yet Jefferson said that every slave owner is a petty tyrant. At the end of his life, even if he had wanted to free his slaves, he did not. Perhaps because personal debt prevented him from doing so. Jefferson wrote strongly against slavery, yet he owned slaves virtually all his life. 2 years before they declared independence, Jefferson joined George Washington, George Mason, and other Virginia leaders to work to abolish the slave trade. But King George III prevented these Fairfax Resolves, as they were called, from going into effect. This was before William Wilberforce's 50-year Christian crusade in Parliament to abolish the slave trade, and then slavery itself, in the British Empire. Slavery was an inherent contradiction to a group of men declaring that all men are created equal, European critics of America could not help but notice.
The tragedy of this country was the inconsistency. You take, say, Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. He complains that the loudest yelps for freedom, as he put it, comes from people driving slaves.
Despite the inherent contradictions in the third president's life, his masterpiece was the Declaration of Independence, which drew heavily from a variety of different sources, mostly Christian sources. The Declaration itself did not come in a vacuum. It was the climax of a struggle that was slowly building over months.
So we see that when it comes to Thomas Jefferson, he was a mixed bag. He wasn't a completely orthodox believer in Jesus, but he certainly was not an atheist. Furthermore, Jefferson did allow for Christian expression in the public arena. He wouldn't agree with the anti-Christian censorship in the public square that we see so often today, actually in his name. He promoted legislative and military chaplains. He granted aid to Christian churches and schools to teach the faith to Indians. He attended regularly the Christian worship services held on Sundays in D.C. Where? In the U.S. Capitol building with his approval. The real Thomas Jefferson was much more faith-friendly than we're led to believe today. For Providence Forum, I'm Dr. Jerry Newcomb.